The letter Sheikh Hamdan never sent, but wrote anyway. There are things that get written and never sent. Every person who has ever loved someone and lost them knows this. The letter drafted at 2 in the morning when the feelings have nowhere else to go. The message started and then deleted. The words that made it all the way to the page and then stayed there, unsent, because sending them would have required a kind of courage that the moment could not quite produce, or because sending them would have changed something that the writer was not ready to have changed, or simply because by the time morning came, the window had closed and the sending was no longer possible in the way it had been possible in the dark. Sheikh Hamdan has written that letter. Not once, many times. Letters that went nowhere. Words that reached the page and stopped there. Feelings that were fully expressed and then kept. Held there private, folded into the silence that surrounds his real life, never delivered to the person they were written for. And today we are going to talk about what was in them, what he could not say out loud, what he wrote in the dark and then kept because sending was not an option available to a man in his position, and what the writing of them cost him anyway, even without the sending. The letters are not separate from the poetry. That is the first thing to understand. Everything Hamdan writes exists on a spectrum between the private and the public. The poems that get posted to his account, the ones that millions of people read and feel moved by and share with each other because the feeling in them is real enough to cross the distance between strangers. Those are the versions that have been considered and shaped and decided upon. They are real, but they are the real that has been processed enough to become shareable. Underneath them, in the hours before the processing begins, there is a raw version, less shaped, less aware of the audience, more specifically addressed to the one person or the one moment or the one feeling that the public poem was eventually going to be built from. The letters live at that rawer level, where the feeling has not yet been translated into something the world can receive, where it is still just itself, direct, named, specific, addressed to someone rather than to everyone. He wrote to her after she left. That much is known by the people who have been close enough to this story to know the things that never make it into any official record. After the woman who had given up everything finally took herself back and left the chapter they had been living together. After the silence that followed the leaving had settled into something permanent rather than something that was going to resolve itself. He wrote, not the public poem that appeared later, before that, the private version, the one where her name was in it, where the specific things that had happened between them were named, rather than translated into image and metaphor, where the grief of the ending was documented in the direct language of a man talking to one person rather than the layered language of a poet addressing the world. He did not send it. The reasons are not complicated. Sending would have required reopening something that had been closed with real cost to both of them. Sending would have created a response or a non-response that would have had its own consequences. Sending would have moved something from the private grief into the shared space, and shared spaces in his life have always eventually become managed spaces. Something in him understood that what he had written belonged to the category of things that are real without being useful, that the sending would not have given back what had been lost, would not have restored anything, would only have made both of them feel the ending more precisely, which is the last thing either of them needed. So he kept it, the way he keeps everything that cannot be made public, in the private archive that exists alongside the official one, the version of his life that no palace statement will ever reference, and no official announcement will ever acknowledge. The letter joined the other unsent things, the other words that were written fully and honestly, and then held rather than released. Because the world outside the writing is not always ready to receive what the writing contains. There is something important about the writing, even without the sending. This is what most people who talk about unsent letters miss. The point of the writing is not always the delivery. Sometimes the writing itself is the thing. The act of taking what is inside you and putting it into a form that can be looked at, that has edges and a beginning and an end, that exists somewhere outside the feeling itself. That act does something. It does not fix the feeling. It does not resolve anything about the situation that produced the feeling, but it changes the relationship between the writer and what they are carrying. It makes it slightly less impossible to carry. And for a man like Hamdan, who carries things that most people will never have to carry and carries them with a consistency and a grace that the world admires without understanding what it costs, that slight reduction in impossibility is not nothing. It is, in fact, the thing that makes continuing possible. The letters accumulate over years, not just to the woman who gave up everything, to all of them. The one who waited 7 years, the one who was deleted overnight, the one who refused him, the one whose child carries his name without his public acknowledgement. Each chapter of his private life has produced words that went to the page and stopped there. A private archive of everything he has felt that was too real and too specific and too personal to survive the translation into the managed, public facing language that the official version of his life requires. Each letter is a document of a moment when he was more fully himself than the world is usually permitted to see. What would those letters say if they could be read? The people who know him well enough to speculate speak about them the way people speak about the things they most wish they could access, with a specific reverence for what they represent. They would say what his poetry always tries to say, but rarely gets to say completely: that the love was real, that the losing was real, that the life the world sees is not the complete life, that there is a man underneath the crown prince who has felt things that deserved more space than the palace and the position and the royal family and the political history of an emirate were ever going to allow them. That the feelings were there, fully and honestly, whether or not they could ever be fully and honestly expressed to the person they were intended for. He will probably write more of them. The circumstances of his life as they currently stand do not suggest that the need for unsent letters is going to decrease. The gap between what he feels and what he is allowed to say remains as wide as it has always been. And in that gap, the letters continue to accumulate, addressed complete, expressing everything with the honesty that only private writing allows, and then kept, held in the silence that surrounds the real version of his life, never sent, but written. And the writing, even without the sending, is a form of fidelity to the feeling it deserves to be recognized as such. He is faithful to what he has felt, in the only way his life has ever consistently allowed him to be. Not with actions, not with presence, but with words that reach the page and stay there, honest and complete and addressed to someone who will never receive them. That is the letter Sheikh Hamdan never sent. That is what it means that he wrote it anyway. Subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. Every week I bring you the real story of Sheikh Hamdan, the words he wrote and kept, the feelings he expressed and never sent, and the truth that lives in the private archive the world was never supposed to see.